you. Thanks for having us. So I'm gonna get my electronicals turned on here. And yes, I know that's not a word. I used that on purpose.
I like it. It works well.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen, I think? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we are going to be talking about optional practical training. A couple of things to note as far as questions and answers. You can ask. This is for you all. So if we go over something and it doesn't quite make sense, feel free to put a question in the chat or raise hand and unmute yourself, and we can answer those questions as they come up. If your question is about something that we'll get to a little bit later on, then we may ask you to hold on to that until we get to that section of the workshop. And then credit for this workshop will be good for the academic year. So if you're finishing at any point this year, then you do not have to attend another OPT workshop. And can I just ask real quickly, is anybody graduating? Do we have any second years on or any folks who are graduating in spring 2022? Okay, looks like yes, we do have a few. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's get started. So we are going to be talking about what the OPT benefit is so that you can have a good understanding of that. There are some current immigration climate implications. We'll go over that. That is shifting a bit and shifting in a positive direction, which is great to be able to say. We'll also go over making a plan for your individual OPT timeline, which is specific to you and whether you've got a job offer, you're still looking, you plan to travel internationally before, after graduation and before starting work. So we'll talk about kind of the variables that go into that. Making a request for your OPT recommendation and filing your application. So this is an application that you have to file with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And it requires you to have an OPT recommendation from the school that has your CBIS record. So we'll go over both of those parts, the internal piece of requesting the OPT recommendation and the external piece of applying for OPT with USCIS. And then we'll also cover using the OPT and maintaining your status. And that's super important once you're on post-completion OPT because the options for repairing status get pretty limited. Options for repairing status and keeping the work authorization viable get pretty limited. So we'll spend some time on that. All right, so what is OPT and who can use it? It is an F1 benefit. So you do have to be an F1 student in order to make use of it. You have to be an F1 student in good status. And because of the way the regulations are structured, this particular work benefit has to be approved by the Department of Homeland Security, and USCIS is the benefits branch of the Department of Homeland Security. So this is going to them for review and approval. OPT is an extension of your F1 status. So you're not changing visa types. You're not changing visa categories. You're continuing on in your F1 status beyond the end or beyond the completion of the academic portion of your program. It is work authorization. So it gives you temporary work authorization that is 12 months in duration. And you can repeat OPT at a higher educational level. So the regulations on repeat use of OPT stipulate that as long as you're using it at a higher level of education than your previous use, you can get access to OPT again. So for the sake of example, let's say that your first degree in the United States was a master's, you used OPT at the end of that master's degree, and now you're doing another master's. If you've already used your master's level OPT, you don't get to repeat use of OPT at the master's level for a second master's degree. So that's what that provision means. And it is temporary, and the boundaries for the work permission, it only gives you permission to do work that's directly related to the major of the degree you're completing right now. So let's say you've got a previous background in chemistry, but right now you're doing an MS in data science or an MBA, then the work that you do with this OPT has to be related to this current degree. It can't be related to a previous degree level. It's got to have a tie to what you're doing now. And the employment should be equal with the level of education that you're completing. So when we look at eligibility for OPT, because it's an F1 benefit, you've got to be in good F1 status. In good F1 status, so that means that you've been enrolled full-time every semester, making normal progress towards your program. You haven't worked without authorization. Your documents are all valid and in good shape, all of that good stuff. You need to have been full-time enrolled in F1 status for at least an academic year. And this would include students who were, let's say, maybe part of your fall 2020. Well, let's see, we've got a number of COVID situations, so let me classify that a little bit differently. If you started your program before COVID, you had a remote semester during COVID, and now you're finishing in person, that remote semester in the middle still counts as enrollment in F1 status time. If you began your program remotely and then entered the US to continue, then your F1 status clock began when you entered the United States on that initial attendance I-20. And you have to be coming up on completion of a degree program. So you have to be in your last term and eligible to graduate in order to apply for the OPT. You do want to consider timing of your application if there's any chance that your graduation could be delayed. And the reason for that is if you're applying for post-completion OPT, this is a post-completion benefit, which means you're only eligible to use the work authorization if you've actually completed the degree. So if there's any chance that you might need to enroll again, then it's worth getting some advising on the timing of your application. Your application has to be timely filed, and this takes into account two factors. So one, it's when USCIS receives your application, and it's also the validity of your OPT recommendation. So when you go through this process with us, you're requesting the OPT recommendation that you need to send your application, to include in your application to USCIS. So once we create that recommendation, we go into your CBIS record and recommend OPT for you. That generates a new I-20, which we refer to as your OPT I-20. And that I-20 cannot be more than 30 days old at the time that USCIS receives your application. So there's two pieces to that. You want to make sure that they've received the application within the filing window that's established in the regulations, and that the recommendation is still valid when they receive it. And we'll talk a bit more about that. You also can't have been granted or have used a year or more of full-time curricular practical training. And so that means during the course of your academic program, all of your full-time CPT added together has to be less than a year in order for you to still be eligible to apply for your OPT benefit. And like I mentioned earlier, you cannot have already used OPT at this level or a higher level. So if you've used OPT before, but it was at the bachelor's level, you still have access to a master's level OPT as long as you've not completed a master's in the US and used OPT at that level. All right, so there are different categories of OPT. Pre-completion, post-completion, both draw on the same 12 months. So this isn't coming from a different pot. If you use some of your OPT during your program, then that's subtracted from the 12 months that you have that you can request once you graduate. Then there are two extensions. There's the 24-month STEM OPT extension that applies to folks who have STEM majors that are on the Department of Homeland Security approved list of STEM degrees. Those folks are able to apply for 2 years, 2 additional years of OPT. If you are sponsored for an H-1B employment visa by a CAP subject employer, so this pretty much is going to mean by an industry employer, then you're eligible to apply for a temporary extension of your OPT that's meant to bridge the gap between the end of your post-completion OPT and the start of your CAP subject H1. So we'll also go over that. All right, so what has changed and how does this affect you? In the run up to 2020, we were seeing some very concerning trends with regard to federal agency oversight and enforcement of the regulations for students on F1 OPT, monitoring of the STEM extension and STEM OPT employers. We have seen that back off just a bit. COVID probably has a big part to play in that. So we're still not sure where things will land once the world returns to a little bit more of a normal and once the pandemic is more under control. So that's still something to consider. The regulatory groundwork for that oversight enforcement is definitely there. It's always been there. So then we kind of come back to what are the priorities for the current administration in regards to immigration enforcement. There were also a number of internal agency policy changes from 2017 through 2020. And a lot of those policies changed at United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that's the branch that processes OPT applications. We'll talk about a few of those. And then processing times continue to be a bit of a roller coaster. Sometimes they're really quick, like right now, and then other times they're a bit more protracted or longer. So what does this mean, especially for students who are planning to pursue OPT or who are on OPT? It puts a much stronger importance on maintaining status. And this has a few implications. So the timing of your application and whether your application is rejected or denied can introduce a status issue. Like we said, the OPT application is an extension of your F1 status, but in order for your status to continue, the application has to be timely filed. And that's puts you into the filing window that's established in the regulations. So if your application, let's say you file it late into that filing window, it's denied or rejected, but you don't get notified until after that filing window has closed, that creates a status issue. The other status related piece comes from status violations that happen while you're on OPT. And the primary one that folks have to manage the primary ones folks have to manage are the CVIS reporting, required CVIS reporting, and managing unemployment. So the regulations require F1 students to report within 10 calendar days of any change in their local address where they're living. So that's always the case. But now that you're on post-completion OPT, that expands to include any changes in your employment information and your legal name. So local address, legal name, employment information. Any changes in those things have to be reported to the school that has your CVIS record within 10 calendar days of the change. Reporting your employment is the only way that the Department of Homeland Security knows that you are employed. The regulations also introduce a limit to how long you can be unemployed during your post-completion OPT, and that limit is 90 days. So then you can see how reporting your employment on time is key to making sure that your record and your OPT remain viable. You can have up to 90 days of unemployment, but if you exceed that 90-day limit, then you have a status issue and you're at risk of follow-up from the Department of Homeland Security. We'll talk more about maintaining status and how to sort of manage that piece. The I-765 application itself and USCIS review of that application have become a bit more tricky to manage. So the application went from being 2 pages to 7 pages. It asks for a lot more information, and this was a couple of years ago. And also USCIS put into the application instructions a lot of things that had previously just been their guidance on how to file petitions and applications with them. And this means that they've made it easier to deny applications for technicalities. So it's really important to follow the instructions for the Form I-765 to avoid the extra risk of a technical denial. That would mean it's been filed too early, it was filed too late, you used an electronic signature to sign your document. We'll go over those things as well. You also want to be sure that you're keeping your address up to date with both our office and with USCIS during processing. If they need any more information, if they try to contact you about your application, it's going to be via the mail. And if they are asking you for more information, they only give you a certain amount of time to provide that. So you want to be sure that you're able to receive their communications and that you're opening that mail and responding promptly. Processing times continue to be a moving target. Sometimes they're really quick, like right now, we've been seeing a number of applications get approved within 30 days or less. Then sometimes it's not that quick and it's more on the 3 to 5 month end. So that is the variable that we can't really control for. So then there's some things to consider when you're thinking about when to apply for your OPT. So when can you apply for OPT? So like I mentioned, there's a filing window. This is established by the regulations. And this is the period during which USCIS can accept your application. The filing window opens 90 days before the end of your academic program. And this is determined by the program end date on your I-20. And it closes at the end of your 60-day grace period. So all F1 students have a 60-day grace period following the end of their program. And this grace period plays double duty. So it's also the period, the date range that you can use, that you have to use to select when you want your OPT to begin. So you're choosing your requested OPT start date, but that has to come from that 60-day grace period. Remember that you're limited to no more than 90 days of unemployment. So when you decide to file your application, can be an important part of this time frame. You want to factor that into your filing window and your specific situation, as far as if you already have a job offer, if you're still looking. If you're eligible for a STEM extension, then you get an additional allotment of 60 days once you timely file for the STEM OPT extension. But remember that you can't apply for all 3 years of OPT up front. You have to apply for and be approved for the 12 months of OPT first. And once you're on post-completion OPT, you can file for the extension. Okay, so basic steps, you want to establish your plan for OPT. That includes when are you going to file? What start date are you going to ask? Are you planning to travel? All of that, you want to consider those things and map out a plan for yourself. If you have questions along the way, feel free to meet with one of us to talk through your questions and fine tune your plan. You're preparing your applications, which your materials, which you're going to upload into the ISSS portal. We'll review that with you to go over your materials to see if there are any issues or recommended edits with anything. And then once you have that OPT recommendation from us, so once you've got your OPT I-20, you're filing your application with USCIS and waiting for them to review and make a decision. Okay, couple of things to note. Post-completion OPT is only available after degree completion. So while your filing window opens before you've actually completed the degree, in order to use the benefit, you do have to have completed the degree. The degree has to be conferred. This also means that you can't request a start date that is before the end of the term in which you'll graduate. So for example, if you were graduating this fall, the end of the term for F1 purposes is December 18. So you couldn't request a start date of November 1 because you're not finished with the program yet. While you're on OPT, employment has to be your primary activity. So that's the other reason why it can't begin until your academic program is over. There is also a 14-month rule in the regulations that impacts how much OPT you'll receive when USCIS is processing your application. And this means that there is a maximum possible end date that they can approve for you. So this impacts the timing of when you choose to file your application and and it can impact you if processing has slowed down and they're taking a long time. If you file your application toward the end of the regulatory filing window, it's possible that you could lose some of your OPT time. So this is what we mean by that 14-month rule. That comes from your 60-day grace period, plus your 12 months of OPT eligibility. This is where the regulations get that 14 months. And that means that in this example, this is the maximum possible end date that USCIS could give to a student that's graduating this semester. So when we look at the whole timeline mapped out, your filing window opens 90 days before your program end date, which would be the end of the semester that you're planning to graduate in. And it closes with the end of the 60-day grace period. USCIS processing time could exceed that. So any day that your application is pending beyond the end of your grace period, that's a day that's coming off of your 12 months of OPT, because by regulation, they can't give you an end date that's later than 14 months after the end of your program. So if you were to apply at the end of your filing window, and then this example, we're looking at fall, if you apply February 1st, USCIS doesn't approve it until, let's say, April 30th, they can't give you an end date of April 2023. They can still only give you the maximum possible end date of February 15, 2023. Does that make sense the way I've explained it? Any questions there on the timeline?
Sorry, could you re-explain that?
Sure. Okay, so your filing window is your 90 days before your program end date through the 60 days following your program end. So that gives you a total of 5 months to file your application with USCIS. And all of that is calculated based on your program end date. And let's move a bit here. This might make a little bit more sense. So if we look at the spring timeline, for folks who are graduating in spring 2022, the end of the semester is May 13th. So that means your filing window opens on February 12th. That's the earliest date that USCIS can receive your application. Your grace period is 60 days following the end of your program. And that means that the earliest start date you can request in this scenario would be May 14th. The latest start date you can ask for is July 12th. It also means in this scenario that the latest possible end date that USCIS can approve for a spring graduate is July 11, 2023. So if you were to file your application on July 1st, but USCIS doesn't approve it until October, you're losing some of this OPT, this 12 months of OPT. So the latest possible end date they can give you is still in July of 2023. So every day that your application is pending beyond the end of the 60-day grace period, that's a day that's coming off of your OPT eligibility. And so they can't give you a full 12 months. If USCIS gets to your application on or before the start date that you've requested, they will give you the start date you've asked for as the start of your OPT. And then 12 months later is the end date, as long as there's still 12 months within this 14-month period. If they get to your application after the start date that you've requested, they will give you the date that they approve your application as the start of your OPT. And then if they can still give you 12 months within this 14-month period, they will. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the timeline?
I've been no, I mean, at least he's got a bit of stock. He said he based his whole style on Aerosmith.
Oh, I was trying to catch up with that. I was like, wait, I don't understand the question. Okay, so we're good to move on from here. This makes sense? Okay, and I'm going to back up just one slide and go over, oops.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Sorry, did
I have a
somebody
quick question.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, go ahead.
So if I've already got my offer and my firm has already set a start date that's past the 90-day period.
Okay.
Like I know the max unemployment limit is 90 days, but my firm is starting either September or October as a universe class start day. So there's no way I can request an earlier start date. So how would I go from there?
Yeah, so the best thing you can do in that situation is try and minimize how much of your unemployment time you're using. So filing early with a requested start date of the latest possible start date is a good way to go in that scenario. So you could ask for July 12. Oh my goodness, 3022, good Lord. I just now caught that 2022 as your start date. And then that would give you a shorter amount of time to manage. Technically, it would be a strategy to apply late, and any time that your application is pending does not count against you as unemployment time, but it does mean that you won't have a full 12 months of OPT. The other risk with applying late is, let's say, for some reason your application is rejected or denied. If you get notified of that after the end of the filing window, you can't refile for the OPT. So that is a strategy, but there's some risks there. A better approach is to apply early, request the latest start date possible, and then if you're not comfortable with how much unemployment time you'll use, maybe looking for a temporary job that you can work in the interim. Does that make sense?
Yes, but one more question is if I have to prepare for my exam for the job. So let's say they have to do either a series test or like bar examination to kind of get the license for the job. Would that be able to count toward under USCIS definition? Would that be able to count as like employment time, or it's still unemployment?
If you're not attached to an employer as their employee during that time, then that would be considered unemployment. So once your OPT start date, once your OPT is approved and the start date has arrived, if you don't have a job to begin on that day, that's your first day of unemployment.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions on the timeline? Okay, so just real quickly to go over, and this is a roughed out version of what a Mod 3 early completion might look like. If you're in the position to request an early completion letter from Owen, and let's say this is in connection, this would really only be in connection with an attempt to get into the H-1B processing cycle for fiscal year 2023, which would start in October of 2022. Then this is the time frame that you're looking at. The earliest that you can apply, so that your program end date would be adjusted based on a planned completion of all degree requirements by Mod 3. So the filing window opens in December 11, closes with the end of the grace period, which adjusted would be May 10. And then this is your timeline and the range of dates that you can request. And Brooke, did you want to chime in here and say anything real quick about the Mod 3 completions?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Annette. So one thing I'll add is we'll be sending out more, if you are a second year MBA student, we'll be sending out more information about this soon. We've been in touch with Annette on this, and we're also working with the Academic and Student Affairs Office just to make sure we get all kind of the details of this down and right. So I'm hoping to have something out to you all in the next week or so. It'll give you a little more detail. But if you do want to pursue this route, I think one of the key things to remember is you definitely want to work with your Owen's academic advisor, either Liz or Shep, and be talking with them a little bit more about this, just to make sure that you've got it clear, to make sure that you are able to complete your requirements for your degree on time. One other thing I will add is, we've been talking about this a little bit earlier, is for Owen students, when you are applying for OPT, that should make sure that you want to send that to, it looks like at this point it's probably Jerry West, but we'll be confirming that just to make sure that is an option. We don't at present have early completion for Masters of Finance students. I think if there's interest in there, I think that would be something that I want to connect with faculty on and talk with Cherry to see if that could be a possibility at some point, to your question, Paul. One last thing I will say, if Annette, since I'm on my soapbox for a moment, if you don't mind going to that next slide, I'll put in my quick plea, and this is for anybody here who's thinking about graduating. Please pay attention to these deadlines. And I think, to me, this is one of the most important slides with this filing window opening in February for those that are graduating in May. And the reason I point that out, and I will champion listening to ISSS and all this, is almost every year we end up having a student or two who, I know it's a busy time of year, you're wrapping up your degree, and you may just forget to apply early. And I can think of one student last year, an MBA student, who he had an opportunity, wanted to start working with an employer. He'd worked with them some in the past, and he had to wait. He had to wait a couple of weeks because he was just waiting for his OPT to be processed because he hadn't applied earlier. So I think it's just a really good reminder to stay on top of this, and that we've typically done another one of these sessions around that time in February, partly to give you all a reminder, or in case you want to join and have more questions on this. But if I were you, I would do whatever, put on your calendar now, or get a tattoo that says, remember in February to not forget, or soon thereafter to not forget to apply for OPT. So thanks, Annette.
All right, so if there are no more timeline questions, we will move on to sort of the employment requirements. So it's important to remember that you are choosing your employment. You don't have to run that through us. In a sense, you're not seeking our approval, you're choosing the job, but remember that you have to be able to explain how the work you're doing is connected to what you studied. So part of your reporting requirements, as a part of your reporting requirements, DHS requires you to include a relevant statement that makes that connection. And then that goes into your CBIS record and can be followed up on by DHS if they choose. So you're choosing any work that you do to be considered employed. And for that employment to be valid, it has to be directly related to your major field of study on your I-20. It should be equal with the level of education that you're completing. And the statement on how it's relevant has to meet DHS requirements, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. There are two ways to look at being considered employed for the purposes of OPT. One of them is based in the federal regulations, and one is based on policy guidance. They're both valid. However, there's a little bit of built-in risk if you're considering yourself employed based on policy guidance, because if an agency wants to change the federal regulations, there's a prescribed process that they have to go through. It requires them to make advance public notice. If an agency wants to change their own internal guidance, then they just have to follow their internal rules, which oftentimes does not include a requirement to notify the public. So then if you're basing it on policy guidance, that could change with very little notice, and you might be left scrambling. So based on the regulations, if you're working full-time in a paid position that's directly related to your field of study, you're considered employed for the purposes of OPT. If you are working based on policy guidance, if you're working at least 20 hours per week, And in a paid or an unpaid position, you can still be considered employed for the purposes of OPT. You have to keep in mind, though, that there is a little bit of an extra qualifier with unpaid employment. The policy guidance says that this is only okay where it doesn't violate labor law. So that means there's some extra considerations you want to take if you are considering unpaid employment as maybe a part of managing your unemployment time. So you can work as much as you want, although I don't recommend starting workaholic tendencies early. Take it from me, it's hard to roll that back once you get in there. So you can work as much as you want, but you have to be working at least 20 hours per week to be considered employed. You can work for multiple employers. You can do multiple short-term employment gigs. You can do consulting for hire. You can work through a third-party placement agency. You can do a startup. All of that is counted as employment during OPT, including internships or fellowships, if that's something that you're doing. If you're looking at unpaid employment, then that's where you want to be a little bit more careful. While you can definitely do unpaid work while you're on post-completion OPT, you can't do that when you should be paid. So this goes back to that statement about it's only okay where it doesn't violate labor law. So in essence, that means an employer can't have you come in, you're sitting right next to Beth. You and Beth are doing the exact same thing, only Beth is taking home a paycheck and you are a volunteer. That would not be okay. What we do recommend for students who are considering unpaid work, we strongly recommend that you request a letter upfront from the employer that confirms that they're offering you unpaid work. This is what you're going to be doing for X amount of hours per week, and that you come up with a way to track your employment time, your weekly hours with the employer. The reason for this is if DHS asks you to prove that you did not exceed the 90 days of unemployment, they will ask you for records from your employer and would not necessarily accept your own records. If the employer maybe wasn't on the up and up and they don't want to give that to you, they don't want to give records of how much unpaid work you've done for them, then that leaves you in a situation where you can't document that you've been working. So we recommend asking for that upfront in writing. If an employer is hesitant to give that to you, that's a serious red flag to pay attention to. You may not be able to do unpaid work at Vanderbilt. That's going to depend on whether the department that wants to offer you that employment is set up to create a non-paid role for you in the system as an intern or observer, if they've got that configured. Once you are graduating, another thing to keep in mind is that your on-campus work permission will end as of the end date on your OPT I-20. So that means that the program end date then is the last day that you can be employed on campus, and then all work has to stop until your OPT has been approved and your start date has arrived. And that includes both paid and unpaid work. So anything that could be reported as OPT employment has to wait until you've got that OPT authorization. If you want to use your post-completion OPT and work at Vanderbilt, that is possible, but the job position has to be a staff position. It can't be a student-based position or require you to still be an enrolled or active student. Okay, so when we think about the unemployment, remember that it only starts to accumulate once the OPT has been approved and the start date has arrived. While the OPT is pending, you're not accumulating any unemployment days. Once it's approved and that start date arrives, if you don't have a job to begin on that day, that's your first day of unemployment and the clock continues to tick. And it counts calendar days. So weekends, holidays, time spent outside of the US, all of that can count as unemployment until and unless you're attached to an employer. Also important to note that once your OPT is approved, your CFIS record is counting how many days of unemployment you have. And the only way to stop that internal count is to report your employment. And so you do want to consider that when you're thinking about when you're going to apply for OPT and what start date you're going to request if you're still looking at the time that you're applying. So the implications, the status implications of unemployment, like we mentioned, it does have an impact on your status if you go over 90 days. So that is considered a violation of your F1 status. Again, the options for fixing a status break and preserving the work authorization are pretty limited, because any reinstatement option would typically require you to be full-time enrolled or planning to be full-time enrolled, which means you have to give up that OPT. Couple of things to think about here. While this does constitute a status violation, our role is reporting. Once you're on post-completion OPT, your responsibility is to keep up with that reporting requirement. But monitoring and enforcement, that falls to the Department of Homeland Security. So let's say that you have been working for 3 months, but you forgot to report it. And then you finally remember and you report it to us. Reporting it to us does not mean we're going to say, oh, I'm sorry, you've exceeded your 90 days of employment, we're terminating your record. And as long as your record is viable and active, we will report in your CBIS record what you report to us. We just can't guarantee that there won't be any follow-up or consequences from the DHS side of things. So your best plan of action is to stay on top of timely CBIS reporting to make sure that you don't fall into this type of a situation. Other things we recommend, think about your employment in the right way. It's not that you've got 90 days to find a job. It's that you can't go over 90 days of employment for the entire 12 months of post-completion OPT. You want to have a plan for managing this. Does this mean that you're going to try and line up a temporary job with a professor because you know you're going to have a gap? Does this mean that you're looking for work both inside the US, outside of the US, so that you've got some other options? Are you planning to go back to school? I know that's the last thing you want to do after completing a program, but that is one of your options for managing the unemployment allowance. So are you planning to forfeit the OPT and accept a job outside of the US? You're planning to go back to school and extend your F1 status that way? You have some options. You do want to keep track of how much unemployment time you've used, so you know when it's time to engage those options. And if departing the US and forfeiting the OPT is a part of what you're thinking about doing, then you want to make sure that you report that departure to us so that we can update that in your CBIS record. Otherwise, it looks like you're still here and you're not working. Okay, any questions on that piece before we move on? Okay. All right, so travel. Can I travel during OPT? Yes, but there are some things you want to know. You can travel while your OPT is pending. Remember, you're in the same status category, so your F1 visa remains valid. You can still exit and re-enter the US. But once your program end date has passed and your OPT is still pending, then there's a little bit of built-in risk for re-entry there, because the regulations talk about what you have to show to re-enter once your OPT is approved, but they don't really talk about what you have to demonstrate to enter while your OPT is pending. So there's always a risk of being referred to secondary inspection where they have access to see this and can look things up. Your best case scenario for traveling while the OPT is pending is that you have a job offer and you have a plan for having proof of your OPT approval to re-enter if your OPT is approved while you're outside of the United States. If you don't have everything that you're supposed to have by regulation, there's always a risk of having difficulty re-entering or having a delayed re-entry process. You can travel while the OPT is approved. You do want to make a note about the visa stamp. So while you can renew your visa while you're on post-completion OPT, the Department of State has tightened up how they look at non-immigrant intent for students on F1 OPT. And essentially, you need to be able to prove that you intend to return home. Depending on your situation, that can be a little bit more difficult to establish. The things that you need to have in order to re-enter, you need to have your valid passport. And at the point that you're on post-completion OPT, it needs to be valid for at least 6 months into the future when you're coming back to the US. Your F1 entry visa needs to be valid. You need to have a valid travel signature, which means it's been signed within 6 months of the date that you're coming back to the US. And let's say you're working in Alaska, you're still going to get your travel signatures from us here in Nashville. So you'd make that request. We would send you a new I-20 with an updated travel signature. Proof of your OPT approval, which is going to be your EAD card, best case scenario. So that's your employment authorization document that you get once your OPT has been approved. We do recommend that you have some travel advising with us if you're planning to travel while your OPT is still pending. And at minimum, you'd want to have at least your receipt notice that shows that you timely applied for your OPT. And your proof of employment. So that's the other thing by regulation you would have to have, and you could be asked to demonstrate. At minimum, that's a job offer letter, but best case scenario, it's an employment verification letter. In either case, you want to have the contact information of a supervisor or hiring manager in case Customs and Border Protection wants to talk to someone when you're coming back in. All right, so maintaining status. This is the biggest piece. It's also simple and complex at the same time. Really, this is going to come down to your reporting, your CVIS reporting, and your management of unemployment time. There are other things that can impact your status while you're on post-completion OPT, but those are the two primary things for keeping your CVIS record in good shape and keeping your work permission valid. So remember, within 10 calendar days of any change to your legal name, local address, and your employment information, you're having to report that to the school that has your CVIS record. And then the way you'll do that once you're on post-completion OPT is through the ISSS portal and some other forms that we have. And you'll want to keep track of your unemployment time and have a plan for managing that as well. Once your OPT is approved, you will get an invitation to set up your account with the Student and Exchange Visitor student portal. This gives you direct access to your CVIS record. We do recommend that you set this up. However, keep in mind that doing your employment reporting, your address reporting through the portal is optional. It's not required. Your mandatory reporting is to report that to the school. So if you do choose to use the portal, remember that you're still doing your reporting on our forms as well. In the SCVP student portal, you can change some of your information. So you can change your home address, your mailing address, your phone number, some of your employment information. You can add and delete employers, but remember not to ever delete an employer that you have worked for. Anyone that you've worked for needs to stay there in your CVIS record. And then when we think about when do you need to do employment reporting? So this is when any of your employment information changes. Excuse me. So that could be starting a job, you're adding a second job, your employer moves you to a different work location. You start working remotely and your address changes. And so you're now in a different location from where you were working. You stop working the second job. Your employer goes through a merger and the name of the company changes. All of that is reportable. And remember that reporting is the only way that DHS knows that you're working. It's also the only way to stop that counter in your CVIS record that's keeping track of unemployment time. When you're reporting your employer details, you'll have to also make a statement on how your work is related to what you studied, like we talked about earlier. From, I guess maybe September 2018, 2019, somewhere in there, the Department of Homeland Security changed how they want you to do that. There's certain details that they want you to include. The job title, the employer's name, whether your work is full-time or the average hours per week that you're working, a description of your duties and how those duties are related to what you studied at Vanderbilt. So you are composing that, that statement, you report it to us, and then we put into your CVIS record exactly what you report. If when you do your employment reporting, some of those details are missing, we would follow up with you and ask you for some additional information. Couple of things to note about studying while you're on OPT. If you begin a new degree program, so whether that's at Vanderbilt or at another school, so if you're getting a new I-20 from us, or you're transferring your CBIS record to another school, then that will trigger an end to your OPT because it's tied to this degree level, this degree program. So if you are planning to do that, then just keep in mind that you'll need to consider when you want your work permission to end. If you do that before your OPT expires, you're essentially forfeiting the rest of your unused work permission as of the date your record is transferred out or that you receive that new I-20. Okay, once you get to the end of your 12 months of OPT, you have a 60-day grace period. It does not give you continued work permission, but it does extend your F1 status and your legal permission to stay. During that period of time, you can pursue a change of status to a different status category, apply for a change of level. You're going back to school, doing a different program, transfer your CBIS record out to another school. If you are eligible for any of the extensions, you want to remain aware of what those eligibility triggers are and what timelines apply. So the first of the extensions we'll go over quickly is the cap gap extension. This applies if you are, whether you're on 12 months of OPT or you're on your 24-month STEM OPT extension, but if you are sponsored for an H-1B that qualifies under this extension, then you're eligible for this, regardless of your major. So you have to be on post-completion OPT in good F1 status and on a valid period of post-completion OPT or on your 60-day grace period. And what constitutes an eligible H-1B is if your employer, you've got to be the beneficiary of a timely filed H-1B petition that's been filed by a cap subject employer. And this means this is an employer that's subject to the government cap on H-1B petitions. So primarily this is going to be an industry employer. And that application has to be requesting a change of status and a start date of October 1. All of those things are true, then you're eligible for this extension. The gap extension does not apply if your employer is cap exempt. So this would be higher education institutions, your nonprofits, your NGOs, or if the H-1B that the employer files is asking only for consular notification. They're not asking to change your status from F1 to H-1B. They just want the visa to be approved and the consulate where you will apply to be notified. Those type of filings do not qualify for the cap gap extension. So when you become eligible, what this does is it extends your post-completion OPT or your F1 status, depending on your situation, from the end of your OPT date to the start until September 30. So it's intended to bridge that gap between the end of your F status and the start of the H-1B, which for cap subject employers, that starts with the government fiscal year on October 1. If you're on OPT at the time you become eligible, it extends the work permission. If you're just on your grace period at the time you become eligible, it extends the grace period only. So it only extends the status. If the H-1B remains pending beyond the end of September 30, then the cap gap extension doesn't renew or continue. It still ends at September 30, and then you have to wait for the H-1B to be approved to resume working. If the H is withdrawn or rejected or denied, then the cap gap extension ends and you go into what's remaining of your grace period. You do want to request a cap gap I-20. This documents that your OPT has been extended. So you would want to request that from us once you're eligible. If you are planning international travel, you do want to discuss that with your employer. It is possible to sort of sabotage an H-1B approval with poorly timed F-1 travel during the cap gap extension. So you do want to get advice from your employer and any attorneys that they're working with on international travel. If your employer files a consular H-1B, we do still recommend that you check in with us to make sure that a cap gap extension hasn't been mistakenly applied to your record, which sometimes happens. For the STEM extension, so if you're in a STEM eligible program, a couple of things to note here. The STEM extension is available twice in a lifetime. It can be based on a STEM degree that was completed in the last 10 years, as long as that was at an institution in the United States. That does get a little bit complicated if this is going to be your second time using the STEM extension. So if you've used a STEM extension once, you do want to talk with us to make sure you're eligible for a second time. When you are ready to request it, remember this is a separate application. The filing fee and the application would remain standard, but the filing window changes. So you can't apply any earlier than 90 days before your post-completion OPT will end. And they have to receive your application by the end of your 12 months of OPT. You will need another OPT I-20. So you still do that process with us. You're eligible based on the code that's been assigned to your major program. So as long as, when you look on the first page of your I-20, as long as that 6-digit code in your major is on the DHS STEM eligible OPT list, then you're eligible to apply for the extension. You must have an offer of paid employment where you'll be working at least 20 hours per week. Or an employer who's registered with the E-Verify system, which is a government system that kind of confirms work permission and identity. And not all employers participate. So, and the employment has to be in the same area as the same field as the qualifying STEM degree. So whichever degree qualifies you to be eligible for the STEM extension, the work you will do during that extension has to be related back to that degree. Couple of other things to note: you will have to complete a training plan with your employer, and that training plan has to be complete before we can recommend the STEM extension in your CVIS record. So don't wait until the last minute to do that, because sometimes it takes a little back and forth to get that right. So it's best to start before your filing window begins, just so you can make sure you've got all your materials in line. Once you timely file, you have a temporary 180-day extension to continue working on the expired EAD. And then you also have some additional reporting that comes in when you're on the STEM extension. And we go through that with you in the STEM extension materials. Okay, any questions before we do this last part on how you apply for OPT?
I have a quick but very specific question. So you mentioned about the travel during the H-1B change of status application, and I was wondering if you have a passport expiration in that same period and you have to travel to your home country, is that something that you need to discuss?
If you have a what in that same period?
A passport expiration.
So you do want to be mindful of passport expiration because it ties back to maintaining status. So you never want your passport to expire while you're in the US. So then you'd be coordinating that application process to renew the passport, which you can do with your embassy inside the US, and you don't necessarily have to travel. But that's something you'd want to factor into your timeline of everything.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. All right, so how do you actually do this application process? Remember, there are two parts. You're requesting the recommendation from ISSS, and then once you've got that complete, you've got all your components, then you're filing your application with USCIS. So you're going to do this online through the ISSS portal. You're uploading electronic copies of all of your documents. And we'll take a look at that list of what those documents are here in just a moment. Once you've got that done, you're going to sign up through our booking page for an initial review. And that's where you'll sit in with an advisor. We'll look over your application and point out any issues or make recommendations for edits. And during that appointment, we'll also schedule your final review. And by that time, you would need to have all of those edits or changes made. We process your application in the interim, and that's typically a 3-day window unless you need more time to make your corrections or edits. Then you're attending your final review virtually, but you want to make sure you've got all of your edited final hard copy materials with you at that appointment so that we can go over your final application and how to put that together and send it to USCIS. We do recommend that you make a copy of your application before you send it so that you know what exactly you sent off to USCIS. And remember the time-sensitive nature of the application. They have to get it within your filing window, and the OPT recommendation has to still be valid when they receive it. So we do not recommend that you hold on to this at all. When you start the application process, you want to be prepared to go all the way through with the whole thing from requesting it to sending it off. And then processing is a little hard to nail down. So you want to give yourself best case scenario, you're applying at least 90 days before you want to work. If you want to be super safe, you're applying at the beginning of your filing window so that you've got as much time as possible. If you're going to send your application by mail, only use express mail. That's the only option through the post office that will get your application there guaranteed within a certain amount of time for the extra money that you're paying for the service. Okay, so I'm going to pause the slides and hop over to the internet, and we'll take a look at how to actually do the application. So when you log into the ISSS portal, you're going to land on your homepage. You go to search online requests, and I've got some dangling chads from the last session. Search online requests, and you're going to go to employment authorizations, and you're going to open or select optional practical training. There's only one term available, and I'm no longer logged in, which this could happen to. You too may have to log back into your account. Give me just a moment to do that. Okay. So when you log in, so when you select the application, there's only one term available at a time. You select that. If you already have started an application, it won't let you create a new one. It's going to take you back to the application you've begun. And you'll see your instructions panel over here on the left telling you everything that you need to do, prepare, upload, complete. And then your to-do boxes will be over here on the right. You always want to start with your application checklist. This is a list of everything that you have to compile for your application. So numbers 1 and 2 are already bundled in to the online request in the portal. So that's not something external. Then you need to have your application fee. It's always recommended that you check the USCIS page to confirm what that fee is before you file. You'll need 2 passport style photos that have been taken within 30 days of your application. And on the back of those photos, you're writing your full name and your I-94 number. If you've had OPT before, then you're writing your USCIS number from your previous EAD card. The photos have to meet the Department of State photo requirements, which we'll go over here in just a bit. Your 2 USCIS forms, and we do recommend that you get these straight from the USCIS website, which is where these links will take you. These are your application pieces that you have to include. And you also need to include a copy of your I-94, your passport bio page, your F1 visa stamp and entry stamp page, If you are a Canadian citizen or you're from Bermuda, you won't have a visa stamp, but you do want to include your entry stamp page. 10 and 11 you will get from us. So this is your OPTI 20 that you'll get at your final review. We also provide a printout of your CPT page as proof of any CPT that you've used. Remember, the new I-765 requires you to include proof of any previous CVIS IDs, proof of any previous CPT or OPT. So depending on your situation, you may have to provide some additional documents. Then you're going to fill in the questionnaires, or sorry, you're going to do these, you'll read through your reporting requirements, and this is a document that you can continue to come back to while you're on OPT, and sign that you acknowledge that this is your application. We're helping you file it, but you're still maintaining that responsibility for your application. And your request. This questionnaire is where you tell us when you want your OPT to begin. So this has to be complete before we can process that for you. You'll also need to submit an academic confirmation that you're completing your program. And so this has to be requested in order for you to submit the application. It has to be received in order for us to process. So when you click on request, you get a page like this. You look for your person in the lookup, and then that will take you to a page where you can type in a message to your recommender to let them know who you are and what this is. And Brooke, do you want to chime in real quickly on where these should go for Owen students?
Yes. For Owen students, at this point, this is Jerry West. Just slight chance that might change, but I will let you know if that does. For data science students, that would go to Dana. She would be the one that would do that. And again, if I hear any changes or any updates on any of that, I'll make sure to let you know.
All right. And then you're going to upload all of your documents. So there's a list here of everything that you want to upload. And then this has to be done before your initial review, because otherwise we don't have anything to review. So you want to have your documents there so we can look at them and give you some feedback. Okay, I'm going to hop back to the slides here quickly. And wait for that to, there we go. I think everybody can see my screen again. So a couple of things to note with your application fee. Use an accepted form of payment. USCIS will accept check, money order, cashier's check. They also accept credit card payments. We don't recommend that you use a credit card payment unless you're filing online. If you're filling in the form, the way that those are processed is they do their initial processing, and then they will they'll destroy the form. So if for some reason the payment doesn't go through, then you've got an application in the system without an application fee, and that causes problems. You want to make sure you're paying the right amount. So like we mentioned, always check the USCIS site before you file to make sure that your filing fee is correct. If you're writing a check, USCIS requires that the check has to have the name and address of the account holder on it in order for them to accept it. We don't recommend using starter checks. That previously had been okay if you write in your information, but there've been some issues with that lately. You also want to keep in mind when you're filling in the check that you're putting the date in a month, day, year format. So 2-digit month, 2-digit day, 4-digit year, or you can write it out. You're making it payable to US Department of Homeland Security. You're writing in the numeric and the alpha value, and you're putting in the memo, your CVIS ID and I-765 application, and you're signing it. And you don't write anything on the back. All of your information goes on the front. You do want to remember, if you're for the numeric part or the alpha part, always add and no cents or 00 over 100 so no one can alter the value of the check. If you're writing a money order, if you're buying a money order, the same thing, it has to be payable to U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The mailing address you can get from your OPT checklist, and then you're also adding your name and address on the form, on the money order. The photos, again, 2-color passport photos that are taken according to Department of State requirements. Got to be 2 inches by 2 inches square on a white or an off-white background. You can't have your glasses on, can't have a shadow or it can't be blurry. So you can check out those requirements on the Department of State website. Any place that takes passport photos will be aware of how to, what those requirements are. Your G1145, this is a notification form asking the lockbox to confirm when they've received your materials. So you're filling this in. And then you're completing the I-765. This is where it's important that you follow the instructions. Those are available on the USCIS site. Remember that the current version of the I-765 requires some additional information. So proof of any previous CVIS IDs, even if you were a non-degree student first semester, then you'd have to include that CVIS ID. Proof of OPT or CPT at any previous educational levels. You want to make sure you're using the correct version of the form. And we strongly recommend that you type your responses rather than handwrite them to reduce the chances of any errors with interpreting your handwriting. Don't leave anything blank. If a field does not apply, you want to enter NA or none. If it's an alpha, you use NA. If it's a numeric, you would use none. And then the form is going to collect both your mailing address and your physical address. For best results, we encourage you to use a mailing address that is not going to change while your application is pending. You want to make sure that you're getting any mail that is coming to you associated with your application. So now I'm going to switch back over to the sample I-765, which we have included in the checklist. And this is a sample of the I-765 that's filled out according to USCIS instructions. So this is here on number 6. There's a sub-bullet there. You want to make sure that you're telling them what you're applying for. And then this is the don't leave anything blank. So if it doesn't apply to you, you want to put a not applicable there. Your legal name as it matches your passport should be what goes here. If you have other versions of your name that you use, then you would put them here as appropriate. On page 2, this is where you tell them where you live and where you want them to send all of your materials based on your application, including your EAD. So mailing address is where everything will go during the course of your application. Physical address has to be where you're living at the time that you file the application. You can apply for a social security number with this application. So if you don't have one, you can provide that here. You can indicate that you want to apply. So everyone has to provide, has to answer number 13 about whether they've ever been issued a social security card. And if you have not, you're going to put none here in this blank. You'll need to check yes, that you want the SSA to issue one, and yes, that you give consent to the Department of Homeland Security to share your information with the Social Security Administration. Then you'll provide your father's name and mother's name in 16A and B and 17A and B. If you have a card and you don't need a replacement card, then you're checking no in number 14. You don't have to provide a response in number 15, and you're putting NA in 16 and 17. If you have had OPT before, then in number 8 for your alien registration number, you're going to use the USCIS number from your EAD card. On page 3, this is where you tell them how you're eligible for OPT. It's very important that your eligibility code look just like this: lowercase c, the number 3, and a capital letter B. Numbers 28 through 31 do not apply at this time. 28 is only filled out when you're applying for the STEM extension. Then on page 4, I'm sorry, page 5 is what I'm going to focus on, where you sign. This has to be an ink signature. You cannot use an electronic signature or USCIS will deny the application. So you're filling this all in electronically, printing a hard copy, and then signing in black ink. And your signature has to fit into this little tiny box. So you don't want to touch or cross any of those lines. And this is because they pull your signature off electronically and put it on your EAD card. This is a problem in some states if there's no signature on your EAD. Page 7 is an addendum, and this is where you tell them anything else they need to know about your application. Everyone fills in 1 through 2, and then you're going to at least make a statement in one of these fields about your current CVIS ID, any previous CVIS IDs, any previous OPT or CPT. We've included a number of examples of how you might display your situation there. So depending on what your status history is, you'll make a statement here. If you have questions about how to do that, that's definitely something we can go over during your initial review. All right. Going back to the slides to wrap up. There we go. Okay. If you are applying for a social security number with your I-765, you're not going to get a receipt within 7 days of your application approval. You should receive your SSN card. If something goes wrong and it doesn't quite work, then you'll have to physically go to a Social Security Administration office to apply. Once you apply, you'll get a receipt notice from USCIS. You want to check the spelling of your name, and you want to check the date of birth to make sure that that's correct. And I forgot to take that note off. We're not currently seeing delays with the receipt process. So usually within 2 weeks of filing your application, you'll get this paper notice. Upload a copy for us. If you see any errors, let us know so we can help you get that corrected. With the receipt number that's here, you can check the status of your case online. This is a static update. Unless you create an online account, then you can opt in for email or text updates. While your OPT is pending, remember that you still have F1 status. You can travel inside and outside of the US, but timing is an issue if you're going to travel while your OPT is pending. Remember that your on-campus employment ends with the program end date on your OPT I-20. And then all employment has to wait until your OPT has been approved and the start date has arrived. Once your OPT is approved, you'll get 2 pieces. One is your I-797 approval notice, and the other is your EAD card. You do want to make sure to upload a copy of those. I would also recommend that you're checking your case status to make sure that you know when they're shipping your card. If your card gets lost in the mail, but it's marked by the post office as delivered, USCIS will require you to pay again for a replacement card. If you can show that it was lost in the mail, then they have waived that fee in the past, but that requires you to stay on top of when it should arrive. Your EAD card will look something like this. They change the design every now and again. There's a statement on it that worries people that says not valid for re-entry to the US. This just means that the card itself is not an entry document. So you still have to have all of the normal things to re-enter the US from abroad. Your approval notice is something you should keep, but if you get that first, it does not give you work authorization. You have to have the EAD before your work authorization can be valid and begin. So you've done the session. What's next? Depending on when you're planning to request your OPT, so if you're looking at doing the Mod 3 early completion or you're finishing in the spring, you want to identify when you're going to apply, get your materials ready, submit that in the portal, schedule an initial review, make any edits. And then once you've sent your application, you want to make sure that, you're keeping track with your mail, updating and reading any documents that come to you from USCIS and providing a copy of those to us. Once you're on OPT, you're keeping track of any unemployment time and you're keeping up with your required CVIS reporting. Thus endeth the sermon. Any questions? Anything that's not clear? Anything that is helpful for us to go back over?
I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording.